kids really differ from one another. They differ in so many ways.
We're taking a deep dive into differentiation, understanding its nuances, and how it can be implemented in schools to foster a more inclusive and effective learning environment.
What most of us had to go on was some common sense. What doesn't feel right in here? And what's something I can think of to do that might smooth that out?
Join us for this discussion with Carol Ann Tomlinson as we explore the importance of responding to and nurturing student interests and passions.
We need to help teachers understand the benefits of proactive differentiation. Again, you really need to make it a mission to know your kids.
Welcome to the School Leaders Project, a podcast series dedicated to helping school leaders make positive changes in their schools and communities. The School Leaders Project is an initiative by Toddle. Without further ado, let's jump into this discussion with Carol Ann Tomlinson. Welcome to the School Leaders Project. I am so excited to have one of my absolute heroes, Carol Ann Tomlinson. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you and to have a chance to hook up a little bit with some of your audience.
Totally. So whenever I was a teacher, I always had your book, The Differentiated Classroom, on my desk. But for anybody else, can you kind of set the stage for our audience? Who are you? What's the work that you do?
I'm Carol Tomlinson. As a young person, when adults ask me the always adult question, what will you do when you grow up? I had no idea, but I had an answer for them, and that was I will never be a teacher. And my reason for that was that I was really shy. So I decided I would never be a teacher and inflict that kind of misery on anybody, and kept up that vow for a very long time, until I graduated and became advertising manager of Duke University Press. One day at lunch, thought I am not going to be sane if I don't do something here. So I looked in the newspaper when we still had newspapers and found a want ad for a job in a high school and thought, well, can't be any worse. So I called the office and told them I was not going to come back that afternoon. Went early on Monday so I could talk to the principal, whom I had never seen. Went in the school office and the secretary didn't say hello, who are you? So finally I said, I think I need to see the principal because I'm supposed to start teaching in a little while and I don't know where the class is. Truth is, I didn't know what I was supposed to be teaching either. And she said, she laughed, and it was a little office crowded. So I got out of the way and went in the teacher's lounge across the hall. And the conversation in there to me was just riveting. Turns out the principal didn't come to school during open hours because he was scared of the kids. So he came late at night and early in the morning, and I had missed him. But the assistant principal took me down a very long hall to the end of the hall, knocked on a door, and a guy who looked very old to me then, obviously much younger than I am now, but opened the door, and the assistant principal said, Mr. Melton, you're fired. And the only thing my brain could produce was, I don't need a job this badly. I did, however. So went back the next day and truly fell in love with the notion that there were human beings in that class that maybe I could make a difference to. I have been working in schools for about 53 years now. Wow. Yeah, a long time. And with differentiation in a formal way, probably for at least 50 of those years. And have had the chance, especially when I was at the university, to be in schools all across the country and all around the world and see amazing things teachers do and have insights because of what I learned from them. So it has been a passion for me since I walked into that schoolroom where I shouldn't have survived the first day. I've loved it all.
And it's such a beautiful thread or theme of relationship. And that even when you first walked into the school, you were looking for ways that you could humanize the experience. And I think that's been a through line through all of your work. Does that resonate with you?
So for the first 9 weeks, the kids had been without boundaries and without any sense of mattering. And in addition to that, it was the first year of mandated racial integration in that school and in that district. And there was a huge amount of animosity and tension and uncertainty.
Trauma.
And unfairness. And it was, they were traumatized in many ways. I think we didn't use that word then, but they were really just sort of at loose ends. And the thing that I think saved me was that despite everything that was wrong, they could tell I really cared about them. And I did. And the longer I was there, the more I cared about them and the more interested in learning about them I was. And I think the message for me in both that place and in the Child Development Center was the huge need that kids have for positive regard and pleasure in their company, and a sense that this is a place where you can be you and it's okay, but also a place where we're going to work hard. And those two things have to come together to make it successful, I think, not just a place where there's empathy and you can do whatever you'd like to, but a place where empathy and teacher belief lead to something you didn't believe you could do.
How life affirming. And I think that if we could take away any message for a teacher, it's that not every kid goes home and feels liked or enjoyed. And if our classroom can be that space, that's kind of the foundation that we need to get into that deeper, richer learning.
Yeah. And that's really hugely true. In so many schools, we have practices and beliefs, intentions that lead us to separate kids in one way or another. So we see the kids who are good kids and the kids who are just average and the kids who are losers and can't do much. And we even sometimes call them slow learners or low learners. And the kids are more aware of that than we are. And after a good number of years of that, they do give up on us. And then, unless they are very docile, they retaliate for the stuff that they're angry about. And so I think that sense of needing to be a place where every kid gets an honest message, not a fake one, but an honest message that they're important and they're valued and that the teacher has great belief in them and enjoyment in them and that they're great just like they are now, but that's not where they're going to stop and we're just going to keep going because so many kids come to us in some way or other broken. And we are the primary vehicle to make that change. The teacher in that classroom is the primary vehicle to make that change, sometimes the only one.
Beautiful. I think that is a gorgeous spot to begin the discussion of differentiation.
Okay.
So might you share with us, I think differentiation feels really intimidating for teachers. It did for me when I was in the classroom. So how do you define differentiation and why is it so important?
Well, it's important because I think our common sense would have told us this for generations and generations, but now we have research that explains to us real clearly, in addition to our own eyeballs, that kids really differ from one another. And they differ in so many ways. They differ in language and in maturity and in home support and dreams and self-confidence and human development and starting points and interests. And every one of those things impacts their learning. And we have practices and paradigms in school that say, okay, you're the teacher, they are the students. And we teach them as though the students is a student. They're all alike. We do the same thing for them, same pace, same materials, same expectations, same support systems, same opportunities to get up and move around, whatever it is, it's for everybody. We've been able to see, as long as there have been teachers, that doesn't work well. And now, in addition to our own eyeballs, we have a pile of studies from educational psychology and pedagogy, and most powerfully now neuroscience, because it's a whole new venue that comes in and explains to us that you can't teach the class. You're teaching brains and no two of them are alike. And if you want to teach them well, you have to get as close to that brain as you can and quit looking only at the students. You know, we have education is, I think, my personal bias is that it's equal parts art and science. We see the art when we're loving what we do and when we see amazing things other people do. We sometimes don't have an opportunity to see the science much, or if we do, it irritates us because nobody writes in English. Doesn't make any sense to us, and it seems detached from other things. But the science of education, it's not unambiguous, but it is real. And there are things that we fairly confidently know. And our practices stop us from doing those things. But the kids are, just watch them, look at them. I don't think I see a day now when I do any kind of reading, and I read something on education almost every day. I don't see any days hardly where somebody's not writing about the emotional angst in students and how much worse that's getting. And yet we still keep trying to cover material and pass tests and treat kids as though they're all the same, and find it difficult to even understand how we'd get to know them as people. And so you're right, it is intimidating. But you know what? So is parenthood. And that doesn't stop a lot of people from having children. And when they bring that kid home from the hospital, nobody says, okay, we're home now, I got this. You find out day after day how hard it is. And you keep, if you're a caring parent, you keep at it. And while you're tired from keeping at it, it also occurs to you that it's the best thing you've ever done. And teaching's very much that way. Differentiation is on some level complex, and on some level just about as simple as it can get. And yet changing our habits in teaching, by the way, is much harder than differentiation is. It isn't so much that differentiation is too hard, it's that changing what we do is so hard. But you don't become a parent in a day or a week or a month or a decade, and you don't get to be an expert at differentiation in that way. But if you keep at it and start slowly and push yourself along, I see teachers all around the world who do magic in their classrooms because of the intentions they have, the attitudes they have, the ways they plan for class. And I don't think I have ever had to my memory a teacher who said, I tried differentiation, it just didn't work and I hated it and so I quit. The people who talk to me say it changed me as a person and it changed the outcomes my
Yes.
kids have. And not a single one of them will say, and by the end of 3 years, I knew everything there was, because they understand that, like any other endeavor in life, becoming a great chef, becoming a violinist, being the funniest person in town, whatever it is you want to do, if it matters, it's complex and it takes a while. And so we get ourselves there just like the way we try to get our kids to do algebra, one step at a time over a long period of time.
Beautiful. I think that begs the question for me, though. How much of differentiation do you think is explicitly planned in advance? And how much of it do you think is just kind of a responsive, more of a relationship with your students?
Well, the way you phrase that, I would think about it maybe a little bit differently than I sometimes think about a similar question. Let me start with a time very soon after I got to the university where I had an epiphany that I should have had earlier. I was invited to go to a school in Michigan, and at that point, I didn't even know where the light switches were. So somebody inviting me to a school was really weird. And when I went, I was really surprised because it was another middle school, and the teachers there all said to me, "We're so glad you're here. We differentiate in our classes all the time. They've been working with us on this for years. We're good at it. We're really on board." And I was so excited to watch them and learn. And I did learn every single class. You always learn if you're watching.
Always.
But I went back 3 times, 4 times, I think, before I had the epiphany. Very expensive plane ticket, 2 or 3 nights in a hotel, meals, sometimes ground transportation. And I had not seen any differentiation yet. I just had not been able to observe it. And so my epiphany was first, if you can't find it on your own, Carol, why don't you ask them what they're doing? So on the 4th trip, I went in and I said, when I see you differentiate today, what will I see you do? And everybody could answer me. And a couple of them said, we've been wondering why you didn't ask that. Slow learner. And so what they would say is things like, well, I come in with my assignments carefully prepared and I give them to everybody. But then if I see somebody having trouble, I run over and try to help. And if they need more support, I'll try to figure out how to explain something to them quickly, but I have to keep moving around. And if they're way ahead, I just give them a little bit more to do. And I began thinking about that as on the spot, what I called reactive differentiation. You come in planning for the class to be alike, the class again. And when you find out it's not working on the spot, you try to fix it. And it's really hard to teach a student to speak English when you're doing that impromptu all the time. It's really hard to help a kid dig out of a deep misconception in math if you just run to them and run away from them, every 2 or 3 days. So my sense at that point was that we need to help teachers understand the benefits of proactive differentiation and planning. Again, you really need to make it a mission to know your kids. And part of that means finding a minute here and 30 seconds there to watch them as human beings and take in some stuff and see what's working for them and what gets them excited and when they turn off. But a large part of that is using formative assessment processes in class to systematically study kids in little bits of time so that you go home with a sense of 7 kids that are clearly ahead of the game here. And so when we're doing X tomorrow, I need to have some sense of something that's going to push them beyond X because they've already got X. And when I see kids who are lacking some skills or who are lacking self-confidence, I need to go in with some plans for those things. And then stuff will still go wrong. And so I do still have to do some things on the fly, impromptu. Sometimes our best ideas are impromptu. But I think there's a gear shift between, I'm not going to quit doing one lesson for everybody because that's what teachers do. So I'm going to come in with the same work for everybody. But now I'm going to differentiate because if I see a fire, I'll try to put it out. That's better than not trying. I think you learn something by that kind of watching and responding, but I don't think it's too likely you're going to change the course of a student's outcomes that way. You phrased it differently, and so I would answer it differently for you. I think teachers who understand, whether it's the first year, 10th year, whatever, that what I figured out the first year, because it was my only hope, is that if you're really into these kids, if you're really fascinated with them, if you really want to be there for them, then you're more facile, I think, in responding to them. But I think you're also probably more facile in saying, I can't keep having this kid frustrated every day when he comes in because he doesn't have a clue what I'm talking about. Or it's just I'm not being respectful of a student who's trying her best to learn English in a classroom where nobody speaks any other language. And I'm just waiting for her to figure it all out. I'm not doing anything to help her figure it out. I think if you have that affinity for them, you're much more likely to begin some proactive stuff. And so from that angle, I agree with you. From the I'll keep doing one size fits all lessons and try to put out the fires, that's not likely to take us as far as we need to go.
I think what I'm hearing embedded in that answer is that as teachers, we need to be very clear about our success criteria. Like, what do we hope that students are able to know, understand, and do by the end of this lesson? And where might those snags come along the way? I think if we don't first have that clarity, then the rest of the using data or differentiating doesn't really happen. Would you agree with that?
I agree with you on that in two steps. It seems so crazy that we wouldn't know that all the time. And yet I have taught so many lessons where that was not in the front of my mind. Sometimes they were fine anyhow because it was in my mind. I just hadn't really articulated it that clearly to myself. But sometimes I was just doing what seemed like a good idea. And so that's an issue, that we don't have that clarity all the time. A second issue for me with that is that in this never-ending time of standardized tests as the judge of everything, nobody on those standardized tests says, what do they understand about this? They just say, what do they know and what can they do? And we have so much evidence that the understanding part is all of it. It's really all
what
of
lasts.
It. The marriage of those, as a colleague of mine said, using understanding and knowledge knowledge and skill in service of the understanding, putting the understanding in the foreground and helping kids realize that those skills we're trying to help them develop and the information that we're working with is a way to get into those understandings and translate them and do something with them. So that's my first problem. We haven't helped teachers nearly as much as we might understand what understandings are and how really important they are and why they capture kids' imagination and why they help kids feel affiliated with what we're trying to help them learn. So that's a big issue.
I'd love to bring out some language from your leadership-centered book that I thought was just really beautiful. And you talk about, as a leader, you have a responsibility to create a vision for a differentiated landscape. Everything feels a little abstract at the moment. What does that actually look like? What is it, either in a district or school level?
Well, I'm a great believer, partly because some of the experiences that I had early as a teacher, but other people's experiences make me hang on to this. I am not very often thrilled with things that schools do to help teachers meaningfully, rich ways. Not that nobody's helping, but changing the way we think about teaching, the way we think about ourselves in relation to teaching, the way we think about the people we're teaching is so important. And we don't prepare teachers for that growth very well in schools. We're worse at that in districts. And people who've studied change their whole lives tell us that it's very hard for a school to change and almost impossible for a district to change. A teacher can change. And one of the things I learned in a couple of very hard placements was, and all of us have heard this language, know these stories, but it is possible for you to shut your door in a classroom, and when the world around you has an unpleasant odor, to make wonderful things happen in that room. And so I'm really big on what we can do to encourage teachers to understand some of the things that you're talking about. And then working with leaders is really important as well. So for me, my vision was the first thing that kept me alive, not somebody else's. Would it have been better if I had had a mission or a vision in a school? It really would have, but I never did. So the ones of us that could come together and create one, that was great. Simon Sinek, whose work I'm sure you know, who's one of the more compelling thinkers about leadership, says that after decades of studying successful groups, which could be nonprofits or corporations or schools or teams or anything else. There's a thing that they don't do that other entities do most of the time. Most of us say, okay, what am I supposed to do tomorrow and how do I get it done? And Sinek says successful groups don't start with what am I supposed to do or how do I do it. They start with why in the world would I want to, starting with why is his thing. So a vision, mine has changed over time. It's because if something hadn't gotten more sophisticated in 50 some odd years, I should have quit a while ago. But it's still basically the same vision. And so I used to start with my seventh graders once I had finally figured out that it was helpful to talk with them about what I was thinking instead of just doing it to them. And usually on the first day of school, if not that, then the second, I'd engage them in a conversation about times when they had been in a place, whether it was a team or a class or a scout group or a church, someplace they'd been, where people kept trying to teach them stuff they already knew, and how frustrating it is when somebody's asking you how, to start over learning and doing drill and practice with stuff that you've known for years. How it feels sometimes if you're an older sister and your mother makes you more or less behave like the kid that's 3 years younger than you, because it's just easy to tell you both one time. And also to talk about times when they had been in some place and somebody was really expecting them to do something and they had no clue, what that feels like and how you respond to that. And my question to them ultimately was, do you think we could work together in this class to create a place that actually works for everybody, where everybody feels important and like there's a way to succeed and help around them to get success? Can we do that? Is that too much to ask? And kids like ideas, they like visions. They're dreamers at most ages. Middle schoolers certainly are still dreamers. And so we had discussions, sometimes in the first day or two of school for most of the class period, but usually, 5 or 10 minutes throughout the week or the month. And the deal was, so what would that look like? And so back up a step, a thing that I did to start that conversation was to do some sort of gimmick with them on different ones, different years. And I'd change them from year to year so I didn't get bored. And then I'd come back to the first one, 5 years in or something. But sometimes I would go to the lost and found in school and get the biggest jacket or sweater I could find and the smallest jacket or sweater. And I'd take those two pieces of clothing to class. And when the kids were coming into the class, and this again was in the first week, I always stood in the door every day of every year I taught, which got to be more important to me as time went. First of all, it was self-preservation, and then it began to be relationship building. But when kids would come in, I'd say, I need somebody that's willing to try on a jacket this morning in front of the class and just sort of stand there. You don't really have to say much. You just have to model the jacket. And if you're game, that would be great. And if you're not, that's perfectly all right. How do you feel about that? And some kids, and other kids, yeah, I can do that. And you're already starting to learn something about them. But I would put the big jacket on a small kid who was willing to model and the small jacket on a big kid who was willing to model and ask them how that felt. And they'd, well, I feel stupid. I can't even get my hands out of the sleeve. And they would just get silly comments to begin with, and we'd all laugh at it. And then I'd say, okay, let's take a pause here for a minute. What if I told you you had to wear this all day today? How would you feel then? And of course, they were new enough, so they thought I was getting ready to do that. And it frightened them a little bit. This isn't comfortable. I can't even write with these sleeves on. I can hardly breathe with this thing on. And then after a little bit more conversation, I'd say, okay, what if I tell you have to wear it for the rest of the year? And they got much more focused then. I think I'd lose some friends. They wouldn't want to be with me anymore. I don't fit anywhere. I'd give up on myself as a learner. I feel too different from the way other people are going to be. This jacket's already restricting. What if I have to wear it for 9 more months? And so the conversation got pretty real. And then I'd say to them before we were going to switch into do you think we can create something better ourselves? I'd say, why did I do this? Why did your English teacher ask you to do this jacket thing? And it wasn't ever that everybody understood what was wrong with me at the moment. I'm sure they all thought something was wrong with me, but always somebody did. And they would say, it's really kind of like school, isn't it? If you keep trying stuff and you don't know how, or if you're keep wearing the same stuff over and over, it gets smaller and smaller and you have to keep doing it, you really kind of lose ground, don't you? It sort of changes who you are and how you can learn. And so that was the affirmation. And I had various ways of doing that each year, but it did start that conversation. And then we had a conversation the rest of the year, which was, how can we make this a class that works for everybody. What would that look like? What does it
Beautiful.
mean to work for everybody? What would my job be? What would your job be? How can it go wrong? How can we keep it from going wrong? How do we start a class? How do we end a class? How do we get those materials put back? And we planned all that together. Teacher still has to be on point, and ask yourself a critical question every night. If I try this with them tomorrow, what are all the ways it could go wrong? And how can I head that off at the pass? What can I do to make it smooth and peaceful? But the kids very soon could explain to a guest who came into the classroom. Ours looked different than other people's, especially early on, because we had people all over the place working on different things. Sometimes we were all together. Sometimes they were working on different stuff in different places, sometimes just in different places, some sitting on the floor. And if somebody had said, what's going on in here, the kids could explain it as well as I could. They understood it, they owned it. And we just worked through it together like that. So that vision did help them. And we had conversations around that vision. Why does it matter for everybody to succeed? Is success as easy for everybody as it is for anybody? Anything that happens in a classroom or in life that is a barrier to success for anybody. And so we had a vision and we built it together and we owned it. And that makes a huge difference. It's that doing stuff with kids instead of to them. And it changes who you are as a thinker, I believe.
It's so much about culture is what I'm hearing, is this idea of what is the culture that we want in our learning environment, and how are we each responsible for curating that experience together, as opposed to the teacher is always the sole owner of differentiation. You're a co-owner of it.
People ask me a lot, well, my kids won't like that because they don't like it if they don't do exactly the same thing as everybody else. And my experience is, not only in my classrooms, but in others I watch, if we do that cold turkey, we've done that to them and we're setting ourselves up for failure. But if we talk to them about, so then why might you use a different book, or somebody be working from a book and somebody from an audio? Why might you need different homework on different nights? Does that make any sense at all? How does that relate back to what we're trying to make happen in here? And they get that pretty well. And then I would say to them, I'm going to try really hard to get this right, but I need you to help me with it too. So if something's feeling lousy to you, don't sit and wait for me to figure it out, because I'm not going to be as quick at that as you are. Come talk to me about that. And then I would find it useful to say, but let me tell you when it's a good time to do that, not such a good time to do it. Not a great time to tell me right in the middle of an explanation that this doesn't feel right to you. So those details have to happen. But when you stand in front of a classroom with 40 kids in it, and it's all your responsibility, that feels very different than when you're standing in front of a group where most of that 40 are willing to help you that day and willing to do what they need to do to make it work better. Much less lonely.
Well, and much more representative of what life is going to be like.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
you have to be able to self-advocate. You have to recognize your own learning preferences and strengths and areas of weakness. And that as a teacher, if we're always doing that to students or doing it for students, they don't gain those skills to be able to take that forward in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big responsibilities or opportunities we have in classrooms where we're looking at kids as individuals is to realize that one reason some kids are way down the pike from others, not the only reason, of course, but they've come from homes where somebody says, okay, so what do you do when you sit down to study? How does that work for you? How do you know you're making sense? How do you know you're making progress? When you think you know something, how can you check on yourself to see if you know it? What happens if you get disgusted? Do you just give up, or is there something else you could do to kind of keep those fires burning in there? We have places where parents give kids wonderful support, sometimes too much, but parents that help kids prepare in those ways. And other places where kids don't have that same kind of support for a variety of reasons. And the reasons aren't because people don't care. It's because the circumstances make it hard to do some of the things or to know some of the things to do that need to be done.
Totally. Yeah, so much of, I think, teaching becomes an assumption of what kids already come in with. And how do we just kind of wipe away those assumptions and really land on what do my learners need to thrive here?
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah, and that whole notion of trying to get ourselves to the place where we say, I'm here today to prove to every kid that they can do more than they think they can. And that doesn't mean more worksheets and more blanks to fill in. But I'm here every day to surprise them with what they can do and to contribute whatever I need to contribute, and to teach the kids to contribute to each other whatever they can contribute to make that happen. including understanding that there really are kids who don't have a clue that when they're reading something, they need to think about what they're reading, or when they are reading a paragraph or a chapter, they need to stop and say, so what's this about? There's so many skills of learning and attitudes and mindsets and things that we need to be teaching kids in classrooms if we want them to succeed.
Carol, one of the things I love about your work is that it's not just theoretical. I find when I read about differentiation, sometimes it feels, again, just kind of in the clouds, and how do I actually do this on the ground? And arguably my favorite tool that I've come across for differentiation is yours. And it's the framework of differentiating by content, process, product, and environment. Can you speak a little bit to this framework and how and where we can use it?
Sure, that's a great thought. I was an English teacher. You would understand the same thing if you'd been a science teacher, a math teacher, a language teacher, but there's vocabulary that forms a framework of every domain. And we know, for example, that if students aren't learning science academic vocabulary, we're going to lose them really fast. And if they don't understand the academic vocabulary of mathematics, it's going to dissipate. The possibilities are going to dissipate pretty quickly. And vocabulary is important because it helps us understand structures. And the same thing's true with differentiation. We need some way to organize it. We need some way to, as you say, to think, okay, I'm okay with the idea that this needs to happen, but I'm getting ready to sit down tonight to plan something. Now what? Where does that go? And this isn't the be all and end all, but it's a pretty fine place to start, is to realize that at the very least, we can differentiate 4 classroom elements that you mentioned, or curricular elements: the content, the process, products, and affect and learning environment. Content is one of 2 things, and it's important to tinker around till you get the distinction. Content is either the stuff we're going to teach or the stuff we ask kids to learn, or it's how we're going to give kids access to the stuff, how kids are going to get access to the stuff. And so when we're differentiating content, it's generally agreed upon in almost all of the documents that support education that with a few exceptions, kids should have the same content goals. Wiggins and McTighe would say, whatever the essential knowledge, essential understandings, and essential skills are for this unit or this lesson, every kid should be working on those. We cover, which is the worst stuff we can do, more stuff in a year than we can remember, let alone that kids can remember. And so what Wiggins and McTighe are saying is, what do they have to have to build knowledge and move forward? So most of the time when you differentiate content, you're going to differentiate access. I'm going to have different print materials, or I'm going to have a recording of a chapter for a student who really needs that support. And I might, for a kid who knows most of this stuff, have 2 really good podcasts for the kid to listen to that extends that information. They might get some access because I'm going to do some small group meeting, and that ought to be with every kid in the class, not just what we unfortunately think of as low kids. I need to be meeting with them and pushing on. But most of the time when you differentiate content, you're really differentiating access and not so much the key learning outcomes.
School Leaders Project, a podcast series dedicated to helping school leaders make positive changes in their schools and communities. In every episode, we talk to extraordinary thinkers and doers about their experiences and experiments with teaching and learning. The School Leaders Project is an initiative by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. Toddle started as a passion project in a school that thought that teaching tech should be as innovative as teaching teams, and we're now loved by more than 1,500 progressive K-12 schools all around the world. If I'm teaching a concept, for example, patterns in civilizations, we don't all have to read about ancient Egypt. We can still differentiate the content that, hey, your family is Chinese. Why don't you read about ancient China or another civilization that interests you? So I wonder, it's a slight addition there, but that's one other way we can differentiate content.
Yes, well, Wiggins and McTighe would say that what matters most is exactly what you started with, the concepts, the big ideas, the principles, whatever you want to call them, and that all kids should have those, all kids should own them. And so Wiggins and McTighe would agree with you. What really matters there is the understanding that all cultures and all times and places have common elements. So how cool is it if maybe we'll all study one together, to just get ourselves started, and the teacher can work with that in different ways that kids can access some information that helps us set that culture up. But yeah, if you all have a curriculum that's based on understanding by design, most of you do, I think,
Uh-huh.
um, is that the concepts and the principles are the big deal there. And so
Right.
when kids can transfer those to other cultures, other times, so in an international school in France where a teacher introduced to her, I think they may have been upper elementary or early middle school, a unit on cultures by talking about who your tribe is. And she was using tribes by like groups you affiliate with, groups that you feel a sense of belonging to. And
Mm,
so kids all found that they had multiple tribes that they belonged to, and all those tribes mattered to them. And she did a wonderful job of helping the kids figure out how those tribes begin to represent who you are and what happens if the tribe's a poor fit for you and that kind of thing. And by the
very
time they
cool.
got to some other thing that was more sophisticated, they were all, they all had plenty of things to offer and plenty of insights. So yeah, you guys may not know this, but international schools usually are far further down the pike in terms of at least conceptualizing curriculum, in that there's a very clear understanding that it's about the big ideas. And
Right.
once the kids have those, then they can knit other things around them. So yeah, always, what we're talking about today is a lifelong pursuit. So we could make this so complicated people would lose their altogether. But
Okay, so
one of the most important things is to say that curriculum has to be engaging to kids. And if it's not, we've
yes.
lost them off the bat. And so the notion of teaching for engagement will always say, find out what they're interested in and hook this stuff to that stuff. Because if you can
Right.
hook this stuff to that stuff, we got a customer right there. And if it seems foreign and unrelated, especially if they're getting 5 doses of it a day or 6, it just wears out. So yeah, you're exactly right. Um, Wiggins and McTighe would say to you, don't ever assume that there's a kid in your class that can't understand the understandings and doesn't have a way to relate to them. Bruner said a million years ago that any concept that man has developed can be taught to kids of any age as long as you understand the age group and how to speak it in their language. And I think that's true.
Beautiful. Okay, I kind of side railed you there. So we've got
That's okay.
content that we can
Yeah.
think of both
So,
as student interests as well as like preference. So that might be an
sure.
audiobook, it might be a chapter. Okay, so we've got content. So the next is process.
Process. Yeah. So, process is when kids quit borrowing the material by reading it out of a book, and there's not a fine line here, obviously, but they're reading somebody else's book, trying to stay interested, trying to work with it. Hopefully, we're teaching them to think as they do, but process begins at whatever point. We're asking the student to start owning this stuff instead of borrowing it from the book. What are you going to do to make sense of it, to know your way around in it, to figure out why things work like they do, what the structures are, or what they're good for? So, process is making meaning of, making sense of what you're learning. And we tend to call what happens in that, it should be a classroom discussion, should be any number of things, but we tend to think of it as assignments that we create for kids, which unfortunately is a lot of times worksheets. Not all worksheets are evil, but too many worksheets are evil. Um, and so what we're really trying to do is, hey, how can I be a catalyst for kids' sense making? How can I help them own this? And your idea about attaching it to things that really matter to them is a great way to help them process. Oh, it's like this. Oh, I had that
Mm,
experience. Oh, I've been that kid in that story before. So process is meaning making, sense making. Art Costa said many years ago that he didn't much care for the word activities. He preferred the phrase sense making activities. And I discovered that as a young teacher and hung on to that. I don't want to too often just give them rote things to do and hope they're going to be able to burp it back, but to be able to give them things to do that cause them to chew on and process and come to own the stuff.
I had a misconception of process. The way I was explaining it is very different from yours, and yours is so much more eloquent. I thought of it as, how will I structure the thinking? How do you scaffold students' sense making is such a better sentence frame for that. So thank you.
Well, what you said, though, if we can put those two together, I think we're really onto something. One is, I like the idea of what am I going to ask them to do that's really going to cause them to think. I don't want it to be
Right.
so prescriptive that they can't get off of a tiny little route, But what am I going to do to get them to think about this, to get them to ask the big questions, to get them angry about something that they think is unjust? Um, but the second part of that is, how am I going to scaffold this so that all of those kids in the class who come from all their different backgrounds can actually accomplish that, so that they can actually do the kind of thinking I have in mind or create a better kind of thinking. So the scaffolding to me is another whole story. If you buy Wiggins and McTighe's notion that all kids should be expected to succeed with the learning intentions, including understanding big ideas and applying those and transferring them, then much of what we're doing is saying that two-part thing. How do I create an experience they can have that's likely to make that happen? And how do I scaffold it in different ways so that everybody stands a good chance of making it happen?
Beautiful.
I love it when the host is thinking so much that she's having a good time with it too, instead of following a script. Yay for you.
We can hang out anytime, Carol.
Yeah.
So fun. Okay, so we've got our content, we've got our process, how we're going to process through the bigger understandings. And now we come to the product.
And product, for me, has been a little tricky over the years. Shouldn't have been, but it has been. In the beginning, when I was teaching in middle school, a product for me was something that my students produced. I didn't have to generate the idea. They could generate it, or I could give them choices, or they could work together to generate it. And some we did one time and some another. But it was some manifestation of something that they created, that they had the essential knowledge, understanding, and skill, and could do something meaningful, worthwhile with that. Now we'd probably call that a performance assessment, although some performance assessments are still pretty flat paper and pencil kind of things. And sometimes we call things performance assessments that may not qualify. But we might now call that a performance assessment, and that might be a better term. But I think kids can do stuff that's amazing with what they've learned, that's way outside the parameters of what I might think of. And so for me, a product is a manifestation of what a student has come to know, understand, and be able to do as a result of a segment of learning, a big segment. That's another thing. I'll come back to that in a minute. But as a result of a big chunk of learning, and that they can apply it and they can transfer it and they can create with it. This is the thing I've struggled with, because the lack of clarity around that term has led folks in a direction that I'm not sure is the best for us to go. A product is not a sketch that a kid draws at the end of a story today to tell you what the beginning, middle, and end was. That's process. They're still processing it. They're new at it. A product would come, in my book, most of the time near the end of a marking period. Maybe one product per marking period, or maybe we want to do one product somewhere around the middle of it and somewhere around the end. But I don't want to overdo those products so the kids feel like they're manufacturing stuff all the time.
Yeah.
So it's a culminating thing for me that comes at the end of a big chunk of learning, not anything a kid does on a piece of paper and turns in for a teacher at any time. Those are just assignments. That's just the manifestation of an assignment a kid did on a given day.
But I think it is the answer to so many questions. I have teachers message me saying, what do we do about ChatGPT? Our kids are going to be able to cheat on all the assessments. And I say, I don't see that as being a real problem. If a kid is choosing something they're passionate about demonstrating and showing you how they've uniquely constructed their understanding, I don't think we need to worry about that, really.
Well, if we all had teachers that sound like you do, we might not. But I do think what you're saying is really important there from what we know already, and we need to know more than we do. But the trick with ChatGPT is not to give formulaic assignments. If you say write a 3-page paper on the history of whatever was going on in this country during these 10 years, ChatGPT can do that much faster and better than we can. But if you're saying, find a parallel in another era that we've studied to this particular era, and then find a parallel in some TV show or movie that you watch, or some aspect of young people's lives, and help us understand how those three things inform each other. ChatGPT is not going to do that so well. So the better thinkers we are, the better ChatGPT can be then a really good thing to help kids do a rough draft of something and see what it shares with them and what it doesn't, and how it affirms what they knew or how it questions it. I think it's pretty exciting that becoming a more generative thinker ourselves as teachers can help kids become more generative thinkers themselves when they have a chance to share with us.
Oh, I just love it. Okay, so we talked about content, process, and product. Now we landed an environment, which was a newer addition to the framework, if I'm not mistaken, right?
No, that's an interesting story too. Everything is, isn't it? Way long ago now, when I was teaching at the university, I had a year where I had a teaching assistant who was the mother of two young teenagers at that time, and had come to the university where I was because she particularly wanted to study affective impacts on kids of different learning environments. Her children were sensitive, and she felt like schools were too abrasive for them many times. And she made a good friend while she was there, who was also the mother of two young adolescents. And the second person was just entering a doctoral program when this first one was about to finish. But yeah, they came to see me one day, and it was after I had written the first edition, I guess, of How to Differentiate Instruction, or maybe the first edition of both that and the differentiated classrooms. And they sheepishly started off and said, we've been talking a lot, and we think it's really helpful to have this framework you're talking about, Cindy. But we think you've left out something really important, and we've decided that it's because it was so evident to you and so natural that you took it as a given, and other people really don't. And if we don't deal with that, then if we have people who don't take that as a given, then it doesn't work well. And what they were really saying was, you've talked about content, process, and product, but you're not talking about affect and learning environment in the same way. So that led me to write a complete little book in response to what they were saying, but also helped me understand that the learning environment thing can't be taken for granted. We take it for granted in schools a lot. I was very fortunate in that middle school where I stayed for 21 years to have a school that was such a good fit for me and for so many of us, and to have leadership that was just nurturing of us. But I can't remember a time that we ever talked about why learning environments mattered and how they can differ and that kind of thing. We talked about everything, textbooks, parent nights, 1,000 things, but in faculty meetings, I'm talking about a professional development, but never environments. And I believe it is the case that creating a learning environment, which John Hattie calls an invitational learning environment for every kid, in other words, an environment that truly feels inviting for every kid in the class separately, is the most powerful thing we can do. And I think without that, we're a little bit skunked. We're not likely to get where we need to be. So a learning environment and affect are sort of interrelated, not the same thing, but interrelated. A learning environment is invitational for most kids if it feels safe, safe from fears of the outside world, safe from bullying, safe from failure, safe from being called on in class if it embarrasses you to have to speak up. Safety is different to different kids, but it needs to feel safe. Kid needs to feel valued, seen, respected. A word that I've started using a lot is everything that happens in there needs to dignify that kid, needs to help them be stronger and better than they were. And so the environment, the affective environment, is how do I create a sense of trust with me and the kids? How do I create, serve as a catalyst for a sense of trust among the kids? How can I help them develop a community of learners instead of just a classroom where kids come in and sit side by side? What can I do to help them learn the importance of kindness, of empathy, of positive responses versus negative responses? How do I help them learn to work together successfully? Most of us as teachers are lousy collaborators, and we expect the kids to know how to do it, and they don't. So what do we do to make all those things happen? And to me, that is the foundation of all of it. That actually is what I had learned my first year. And my two graduate students who came to talk to me were just pointing out that it was not helpful that I thought it was everywhere all the time, because it may not be. The other piece, though, of a learning environment is the physical aspect of it. We have some classrooms that are set up in a way that they don't invite kids to do anything together. Yeah, just sit face forward, wait, and hope for the bell in a while, or hope that art's going to happen so you can get sprung and get out of here for a little bit. And so creating physical environments that make space for different kinds of learners and that enable me then to be able to put kids in 3 or 4 different configurations in one class period if we need to, without chaos. So that's what we're talking about there. How do we shape both the emotional and physical environment to make it work for everybody in here as best we can? How do we keep it flexible? How do we balance stability and flexibility? And that's what the learning environment piece is about. And you do differentiate that as surely as you differentiate content, process, or product. Many of us know that. I mean, you learn when you're a teacher that there's some kids that when they start to get squirrely, you need to go stand beside them. That's a kind of differentiation. He needs me to be a presence, a tall presence in his life every once in a while, and I can do that. And you're doing that subconsciously, but it's with a purpose, and it's trying to help the kid breathe and rejoin you instead of popping out of his skin or whatever. So that's what affect and learning environment mean in a nutshell. So then you can differentiate based on student readiness, interest, and learning preferences. And what that means is, if you get a chart, and it's in some books, but this seems like a whole bunch, but it's easy to figure out after a while. You can differentiate content based on readiness or interest or learning preferences. You can differentiate process based on readiness, interest, or learning preferences. You can differentiate products based on any of those three or all of the three. And so readiness means it is not a synonym for ability. It is not a synonym for how good a student you are. It simply means, given what we're getting ready to do today, what is the student proximity to these goals? It's very practical, very realistic. If anything, it should help us try to obliterate those things of low student, advanced student, average student, and just to say who's ready to move today, at what pace, where are they entering, and how can we help them move on. So readiness means the degree of difficulty of a task based on the student's current performance with the aspects of that task. And pretty much you find that almost every student is at an earlier point of readiness in some parts of what we do and at a later point of readiness in some others. And it should never be, I'm going to put the bluebirds here, the buzzards here, and the wombats over here. It should
Not assumed.
Yeah, that's right. And again, we're trying to quit pigeonholing kids. And so if we're doing formative assessment, we're going to find that some kids know more than we had any idea they did, and some kids are really hung up over a couple of missing pieces they have, and some kids are pretty much okay with this part of the assignment but need more support in this one. So what we're trying to do is to do what people talk about with balancing the degree of difficulty with the student's readiness to tackle it. It's kind of a two-part thinking process too, but what psychologists have generally told us is that a student's the degree of difficulty of a task should be slightly ahead of wherever that kid is right now. John Hattie, whose work I increasingly love, talks about differentiation as +1 learning. What do I do to help each kid move forward a step or two or three or four? Heard a teacher say, this nearly blew me off the map, but I heard a teacher say she didn't know I heard her. I like this +1 learning. As long as that kid learns a new word today, I don't have to worry about anything else. That's not the point. The point is you need to move forward in that journey, and it is not about remembering one more word. But so what Vygotsky told us long ago was that your zone of proximal development, the area in which you're ready to learn, is when the stuff is a little too hard and somebody can help you over the bump. Brain researchers now call that good. Until I started to say it, I knew the term. I'll come back to it in a minute. That's crazy. Anyhow, what they're saying is exactly the same thing. If work is
importance of struggle.
If it's too demanding, a kid simply can't do it right now. It doesn't mean they can't do it ever, but they can't do it yet without some support. And if it's too easy for them, instead of being fried brains, which is what EEGs look like with kids that are, can't do stuff and are in a frenzy about it. The kids that already know the stuff and have known it for weeks, months, show the early brain waves of sleep. And so what we're trying to do is keep every kid's little brain going, wait a minute, not sure about this. And you can't do that with everything being alike, with kids coming in different levels. So readiness is...
And it's so tricky. Sorry.
No, go. You're good.
Oh, it's just so tricky because it's both that balance of student efficacy and agency. So what do they think they're capable of, and what are they actually capable of? And you as the teacher, it's like you said earlier in the call, that it's both the art and the science. So how do you use as much data as possible to figure out both the emotionality and the ability?
Yeah,
not ability, but
No, no, and I get rid of that word. Just
Yeah.
their readiness right now to do whatever is there.
Yes.
But yeah, and that's important. And what you said right there, Cindy, is something I think about a lot and have written about a good bit recently. What I call teaching up, and it's kind of a paradox, really. And you just kind of nailed it really well. Um, when you start planning, if you're in a mode for differentiation, you've got to start planning somewhere. You can't start planning for 35 kids, you know, individually. So what you're looking for in assessments is patterns. What patterns do I see, and who seems to be at a beginning point with this pattern, and who's ready to push it down a little bit. And so, on one level, what you're trying to do is to do what you said first. I need to take into account where this kid is and try to do a kind of Vygotsky thing as well as I can do. Miss sometimes, but if you're trying, you're close enough. Um, and that is, what's a good next step for this kid to take, or for these 5 kids to take, or these 7 kids to take. And then I'm going to keep watching, and 2 of them may need another time or 2 with the next step, and 3 of them may be ready to move on tomorrow. And that's what you need to have happening. But um, so the idea of saying that this readiness thing is real, and I have to have the kid in a place that he's going to have to stretch some to learn, but then he can. That's sort of on a day by day basis. But teaching up says the other part of what you were talking about, and that is, if you have to start planning for somebody and you want it to work best, start planning for your most advanced students. Plan for them first. What can I plan for them around these essential knowledge, understanding, skills, concepts, whatever it is we're working with? And let me plan for what those advanced students would find interesting, fascinating, captivating. And then let me make that a long-term expectation for everybody. In other words, I'm going to start with the high kids, and my goal is to get everybody there. I'm not going to plan a low group thing. I'm going to plan for the
Cool.
advanced kids and scaffold to get everybody there over time. So there's somewhere in there with what you're saying that the readiness thing is a short-term versus long-term progression. So that I may have some kids who are going to head up for that mountaintop at a slower rate to begin with, but they're going to the mountaintop. They really are, and those success criteria are going to be there. And my job is to step by step help them evolve the understanding and skills that they need to get there.
Sometimes we hear that we say, oh, you should have the same goals for every student. And that can feel so like, but really? How? What? And I think the way you just explained it makes so much sense.
Yeah, and that's a tricky thing, and I don't think it's a fault in thinking. The work of I don't know where my brain with names are today. Names are not my favorite dish most days, but Ron Berger and his colleagues who work at what they call EL schools now in the U.S. It used to be Expeditionary Learning. They've gone to KFC now for Kentucky Fried Chicken and just call it EL schools. But the work that they do with kids who maybe country club type kids that have a lot of privilege, maybe just a mix of kids in a school. Frequently, they work in schools where kids have a hard slog to get where they need to go. And they do the most beautiful job. It's their mission in life to set a task or a goal that the kids feel they can't possibly do, and then to scaffold that to the point where they not only do it, but do it well. And it's totally life changing. And I don't see a contradiction between those. For example, in the kids' senior year in high school, they all have to do senior portfolios, and the way those are set up, they are really demanding and complex, and they have to present those in front of a group of people who are adults in the community that are kind of scary to them, and some folks that they've invited, and they work really hard to be able to do those kinds of things. And when they see themselves presenting that stuff and realized everything that they've learned and how many steps they had to go through to get there, it's riveting to see. It's like watching a birth happen, really. And so what Berger and his colleagues do is to have an end goal that does incorporate all those knowledge, understanding, and skills kinds of things. But to understand the pathway to get there is going to be fraught with changes and difficulties, and the insistence and support of people who keep saying, you not only can you do it, but you're going to do it. So let's figure out what's next.
Beautiful. I love that. Love it. Love it. Okay. So we talked about readiness. The other 2 are interest and preference. Is that right?
Or interest and learning preferences. Yeah. So interest is kind of an easy one to talk about. don't use it as much as we should, but it's a fairly easy one too. You gave an illustration a little while ago of why not let the kid look at some of the big questions in the culture of China, if that has relevance, where the culture of Yugoslavia may not have any at all for that particular kid. Um, the idea of interest is, we've known for a long time that when a person is interested in something, they engage with it longer. They're willing to stick and pay the price for success. They, if we're lucky, get caught in a state of flow every once in a while and are just fascinated how amazing this stuff is. And it's really fairly easy for us to attach kids' proclivities to stuff that we're teaching, to show
Yeah.
them that by the fact that we teach it in different venues and aspects, and inviting them to say, where else do you see this happen? Is there anything in your life that represents this? And so interest-based stuff is simply inviting us as teachers to say, we need to know the kids well enough to have a grasp on what some of their interests are, partly by asking them, partly by observing, and then to make every effort we can to incorporate their interest into various aspects of what we're trying to do with them, using their interest as analogies in class, using their interest to form interest-based groups, using their interest in terms of products that they or we might develop, so that the kids continue to see themselves in their interest and can grow their interest in what we do.
Such a piece of this for me comes back to the idea of provocation in a classroom. So like kids might not know yet what they would be interested in. So if we're studying ancient civilizations and they don't know about death rites and beauty and all those things. So giving lots of space and time to go, well, might you be interested in this? Might you be interested in this? And then finally keeping going with the provocation until every kid is a thing that they're like about.
Yeah. I've been doing a little bit of work with an article on provocations in the last few days, an article that I read, not one that I'm writing. The group of preschool teachers in California whose work I think is just so lovely. And they study the kids when they're out in the yard playing. That's what they really do when the kids are on the playground or out in the garden or wherever they are. And they make notes on what the kids are interested in, what they comment on, what they want to linger with. And then they, like you're talking about, put physical provocations in the class, a table with some examples of this and another table with this collection on it. And some of the provocations are ones that they put there for this kid. This kid may not ever go to those, but may go to two others. And the whole idea just is, what does this make you think about? What's cool about it? And it's just amazing to see where those kids go with those provocations. And yes, then the question is, what do we do for provocations in physics and chemistry? And they're there to be had if we'll do it.
And if you really understand your content, I think you're more able to provoke. So if you're not feeling excited as a teacher yet about a unit, or if you're losing, I don't really know what to provoke them on, learn more yourself, become an inquirer, watch videos until you're like, I didn't know that. Like, I think that sense of curiosity as a teacher is so important.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. I read a thing, this is Simon Sinek again, I think, who said the best leaders he knows are not experts. And when he pauses there, thinking, well, how did that go wrong? And he says, because there's no such thing as an expert leader. There is no such thing. It's just not possible. He says, any more than there is an expert parent. It doesn't exist. So the best leaders are students of leadership.
Yes.
It exactly goes on to say exactly what you are. They're people who every day read, every week have provoking conversations, every week listen to podcasts that help them think further down the pike. And it's that sense of, I don't know enough yet, that sense of I have to keep learning. And we need that in classrooms. It's very hard to differentiate well if you don't know your content well enough to differentiate it. In other words, to understand shades of significance and meaning and pathways to get there.
Beautiful. Yay. Okay. And then the final one is learning preferences. And I wonder if you might even just kind of give us a list of different kinds of learning preferences we might not think to consider.
Well, this has been one of my, I sometimes when I'm presenting, somebody will say, well, I saw you 5 years ago in California, and you're not saying the same thing every time. It's not
good for you
message, but if I'm not growing, I should have quit a long time ago. I really should have stopped. Sometimes I grow because of two graduate students who come in my office and point something out. Sometimes I grow because, like you're suggesting, I read like a crazy lady and listen to all kind of stuff. But sometimes I grow because somebody helps me because the science of education changes. And when I started teaching in my little middle school 100 years ago, um, the idea of learning styles was a really, really heavy deal in schools then. And at that point in history, there was research that was better than most research we had in education, pointing to the value of learning styles, particularly with students from low income backgrounds and varied ethnic groups that were different than the mainstream group in schools. But the research was showing that learning styles were a big deal in pushing learning forward. So my first writing was talking about learning styles. And short version of that is that brain research has pointed out to us, as well as a couple of other domains, that the concept of learning styles can't hold up in the light of what we know now about how the brain works. And so we've had people in psychology say, you know, when you start labeling people and you're this kind of learner, you're hobbling them. You aren't saying you're so multifaceted and you can do so many things. We're saying you have to learn this way.
This
And
way.
labels are expensive, and and psychologists also say to us, you know, we've told people all these years to get a survey or sort of pre-assessment kind of thing off the internet and give it to kids, and it'll tell you which kid's this kind of kid and which kid's that kind. They say you might be interested in knowing that there are none of those instruments that have any validity or reliability work on them. And so you're using an instrument that's not valid to pigeonhole a kid, and that's not helpful. And then those folks have also said the concept of learning styles is just wacky. I think there's 73 different models of learning styles, and none of them say it means the same thing. So we're testing or assessing kids to figure out where they are in something that is mush. And so that would tend to make you want to stop. And then the sociologists say, which surprised me that they weighed in, what we end up doing is generalizing. We use those labels and we say, see, African American kids aren't very good at math, or girls aren't good at this kind of thing. And that stratifies people in society. And instead of opening up the possibilities to them, it again diminishes them. So their suggestion very strongly is ditch that stuff. And so I did at that point in my writing, and started talking about another term that I threw in there, which and said very clearly, not learning styles, don't do that. But here's some ways you can kind of find out what kids like, and it becomes an overlap with interest in some way. But even that was getting kind of mushy. And so what I was saying there at that point was find out what kind of kid this is. Not find out what kind of kid, but find out what they like and do so and so. And so what I have done
almost like profiling.
Well, learning profile was the first learning styles, then learning profile. Yes, thank you. So the profile is not so much profiling, but it's trying to find a right answer for a kid, or a couple of right answers, and not saying you are that kind of learner. You have to do that, but kind of keep trying to find out and steer them in that direction. What is most useful now to me is just the idea of learning preferences and saying to kids, you know what? Every one of you can learn something in a dozen different ways. So what's cool is to know what those dozen different ways are, to try different ones out. I don't learn the same way early in the morning that I do in the evening. I don't learn the same way in geometry that I did in algebra. I apparently did not learn the same way in Latin and in German. So just realize that there's so many avenues you can go down, and let's explore some of those. Try some things. Ask yourself, so you get good at it, is this working for me? What does it mean to say it's working? If it's not working, how do you know? And what can you do to back out and do something different? So learning preferences to me now are really trying to mentor kids in the way of agency, to say, keep looking at yourself as you grow and in various contexts, and ask you, in what ways do people work there? And what to me feels natural and useful and good, and what's feeling obnoxious, and maybe obnoxious is good sometimes because it stretches you. Let's just look at possibilities. And so when you ask Cindy about the possibilities for learning preferences, they are many, but some that are kind of interesting is that some of us tend to be more forward out there learners, let me be an adventurer, go get stuff. And others are much more, let me have some peace here. Let me just think this thing through. Some people love working in groups because they value partnership, they value collegiality. Some people hate groups because they can't compete as well within a group and the group falls apart, if it's big on competition. So much of learning preference is being able to say, let's look at 3 or 4 possibilities here. Try one today and see. Maybe next time try one you haven't tried. You might like this idea for a product, but prefer coming at it a different way. So then take the idea for the product and figure out how you want to come at it. And so it's a much more open thing, but you can, in fact, look at some cultural preferences where people have mapped out, and it's always a generality. It's not saying everybody in the culture, but cultures where folks sit and listen for a long time before they speak, and cultures where they start speaking almost immediately, cultures where people value competition and the competition is everything, and others where collaboration is much more of a thing. And you can kind of name those cultures at an international school, I'm sure, where there's not 100%, not 90%, but just a greater percentage of people who say, look, the way to win this is to work together. And if we can work with one another and lift one another up, we'll get further. If we have to compete all the time, we're going to lose a lot of peace in life and other things. So it's really trying to understand any number of continuums of learning and helping kids explore those and make decisions based on those of ways that they think would be interesting for them to learn or productive.
So just not pigeonholing, this is the way you learn. It's a consistent curiosity about your preferences in the moment and what's working for you right now and what isn't. What a stronger way to teach those skills that become useful in life as opposed to something that's done to me. Because I'm kinesthetic, I'm going to do an interpretive dance. Like, you can only do so many interpretive dances, right?
Yeah, when you show me how it's going to demonstrate that you have this knowledge, understanding, and skill in math, let's go there for a minute.
I love it. Well, I've got one final question for you. We began the conversation just with how overwhelming this can feel. And I think, do you have any advice for either a leader or a teacher who's just feeling a little bit like, at the end of this conversation? Where do they start? What is a good, touchstone to come back to?
A piece of advice that I would give folks just from the standpoint of sanity, I guess, in the sense of your own possibility, is use your instincts. Become an observer. Watch kids. Now, this sounds like, the thing that we tease parents about. When you were a kid, you had to walk 9 miles to and from school in the snow. Good grief. Now I get to go in a car. But when I began teaching, I had been a teacher for certainly 12, 15 years before I ever knew there was such a thing as professional development. I found some books that I loved reading in bookstores in education sections, but they weren't what you would consider necessarily professional development books. They were very insightful about teaching and learning and people's stories a lot, the people that were writing, their experiences in schools. And those things taught me a lot. But what most of us had to go on was some common sense. What doesn't feel right in here? And what's something I can think of to do that might smooth that out? This kid is clearly not feeling okay about what's happening. How can I get a little bit closer to see what the problem is and see if we can work on it together? I have a good friend who teaches pre-service teachers in Arkansas. And she has a thing that she does with her students many times on the last day of school. She's an excellent mentor, and the kids have great affection and respect for her. And they usually have a celebration of some kind on the last day. And right before they're leaving, she'll say to them, I just realized there's something I forgot. There is a tool I forgot to tell you about. And I just can't let you out of here with this without that tool. So I want you to promise me now. I'm going to tell you what it is. And I truly want you to promise me right now that on the way home today, you'll stop, maybe at Walmart, and get one of these because you really have to have it to be prepared for next year. And they're all, we'll do it. We'll get there today. And she pulls one out of her drawer and it's a hand mirror. It has a little stem on it and a little mirror at the top, and you can hold it in front of you. And she said, I want every one of you to have one of these and take it to school with you next year and put it in your top drawer. And any day when something's not going right, at the end of the day, take that thing out and hold it in front of your face, and the solution to the problem will be standing right there. I just think that's so powerful. And when I reflect back on the good old days when we had to walk 9 miles to school in the snow every day, that's what we had, was reflection. And for me, the rich thing was that over time, in the beginning, even there were 2 of us who were working on what we now call differentiation. Within a couple of years, there were 4 of us. Ultimately, there were about 12 of us across a small district. And we had each other. The ones of us who were in the same building, close to each other, talked almost every day about things we wish were better, things that we were stuck on. And we didn't actually know to go to Walmart because there wasn't one, can you believe that, to get the hand mirror. But we had that sense of reflection. I need to go home and think this thing through. What the writing that I've done on differentiation is good for is what you're talking about with, hey, that little chart's really cool. It gives you a content, process, product, readiness, interest, and learning preference thing. Is to help you say, so that's what that is, or maybe that's a way I hadn't thought about that. But the truth is, when it comes from you and you're doing what we did by saying, okay, we can't have kids that are 4 years behind and 4 years ahead trying to do the same stuff every day. So what can we do with materials? And one of the great questions we asked was, what can we do that keeps us being an us? What is it we should all do so that we belong together, so that all of this wonderful stuff is ours? And how can we set up a classroom? We didn't have this language yet, but so as John Hattie would say, you can take your own next step during this time. So how do we keep us an us and still make room for that? And we figured those things out. And after 20 years of working with that, we were pretty good at it. And I thought we were darn good until I went to the university and started reading research and thinking, well, that's close, but no cigar. Let me work with it a little bit longer here. It's that curiosity you're talking about, but also understanding that you're the best student of your students, of anybody. And what I'm saying may or may not pertain to this class, or that class might work for first period and not fifth, might work in art, but not in music. So reflection, and one step at a time. Do what John Hattie says, be kind to yourself and take your own next step tomorrow. Keep thinking, keep reflecting, keep asking the kids to join you in making it better, and go one step at a time, just like you do with parenting. It's all you can do.
I just think that's been such a through line of the episode. I think often when we hear differentiation, we think deficit, and your language is so the opposite of that. It's empathy and it's curiosity above anything else. And I just hope that, somebody who needs to hear this, I hope they heard it and come away feeling affirmed, because it's very, very affirmational practice. I just thank you so much for coming on and sharing today.
A great pleasure. You are so eager yourself and so curious and so insightful. You're a wonderful person to have a conversation with.
Oh, thanks, Carol.